I was sitting in my home office in Scottsdale, Arizona, working on a presentation for a client meeting when my doorbell rang for the third time that week. And this time, it was the police standing on my doorstep with a citation for running an illegal daycare out of my garage. My name is Xavier Morrison, and I had just moved into the Sunset Ridge community 6 months earlier after landing a consulting job with a major tech firm. The house was perfect, a 4-bedroom ranch with a 2-car garage, mountain views, and what I thought would be a peaceful neighborhood. I was 32, single, and worked from home most days. I had no kids, no pets, and barely any visitors except for my brother who stopped by occasionally to watch football games. The officer, a middle-aged guy with tired eyes, looked almost apologetic as he handed me the citation. "Sir, we received a complaint that you're operating an unlicensed child care facility. The complaint states there are multiple children entering and leaving your property daily between the hours of 7 and 9 in the morning." I stared at the paper in my hand, completely dumbfounded. "Officer, I live alone. I work from home. There are no children here, ever. Someone has made a mistake." He shifted his weight, clearly uncomfortable. The complaint came from a Karren Bentley, who identified herself as the HOA president. She provided photos, dates, and times. We're obligated to investigate. Karren Bentley. I knew exactly who she was. She lived 3 doors down in a house with an immaculate lawn that looked like it belonged in a magazine spread. I had met her exactly once during my first week in the neighborhood when she appeared at my door with a clipboard and a smile that did not reach her eyes. She had informed me that trash bins could only be visible on collection days, lawns must be mowed weekly, and any exterior modifications required written approval from the HOA board. I had nodded politely, assuming these were standard rules. "Can I see the photos?" I asked. The officer pulled out his phone and showed me several images. They were taken from across the street, showing my driveway in the early morning. In one photo, my garage door was open. In another, you could see movement inside, though the image was too blurry to make out any details. "That's me," I said, pointing at the blurry figure. "I work out in my garage every morning at 7. I do CrossFit-style exercises. There are no children. Just me, some weights, and a pull-up bar." The officer studied the photos again, then looked back at me. "Would you mind if I took a look inside your garage?" "Not at all." I led him through the house to the garage where my workout equipment was still set up. From that morning, a weight bench, dumbbells, a rowing machine, resistance bands hanging on the wall, and a foam mat on the floor. There were no toys, no small chairs, no art supplies, nothing that would suggest children had ever been there. The officer took notes, photographed the setup, and nodded. "This is clearly a misunderstanding. I'll file my report and this citation should be dismissed. Sorry for the trouble, Mr. Morrison." After he left, I stood in my driveway, staring down the street toward Karren's house. Her car was in the driveway, a white Mercedes SUV with a custom license plate that read, "Blessed One." I considered walking over to confront her, but decided against it. Maybe it really was just a misunderstanding. Maybe she had seen me in the garage and genuinely thought something else was going on. I went back inside and tried to focus on work, but the incident nagged at me. Why would she file a complaint without talking to me first? Why not just knock on my door and ask what was happening? 2 weeks later, I received a certified letter from the City Code Enforcement Office. Someone had filed a complaint that I was violating noise ordinances by operating heavy machinery late at night. The letter stated that multiple reports had been filed over the past week, claiming that loud mechanical sounds were emanating from my property between 11 at night and 2 in the morning. I called the Code Enforcement Office immediately and spoke with a woman named Patricia, who sounded like she had dealt with thousands of similar calls and had lost her patience somewhere around call number 300. "Mr. Morrison, we have documentation of 4 separate noise complaints filed against your address," she said. "The complainant states that the noise is consistent with industrial equipment, possibly a wood shop or metal fabrication setup." "I don't have any of that," I said, trying to keep my voice calm. "I work on a computer. The loudest thing in my house is my blender when I make protein shakes." "Who filed the complaint?" There was a pause, the sound of clicking keys. "A Karren Bentley. She lists herself as the HOA president and states she's filing on behalf of multiple concerned neighbors." There it was again. Karren Bentley. She filed a false report about me 2 weeks ago claiming I was running a daycare, I said. The police came, investigated, and found nothing. Now this. I think she has some kind of problem with me. Patricia sighed. Sir, we have to investigate every complaint we receive. I can send an officer to do a property inspection if you'd like to clear this up quickly. Yes, please do that. The code enforcement officer arrived the next evening at 7. His name was Miguel, and he was significantly more thorough than the police officer had been. He walked through my entire house, checked every room, looked in the garage, even walked around the exterior of the property. He used a decibel meter to measure ambient noise levels. After 45 minutes, he sat down at my kitchen table and filled out his report. Mr. Morrison, there's nothing here that could generate the kind of noise described in the complaints, he said. Your property is in full compliance with all city codes. I'm going to mark these complaints as unfounded. This is the second time she's done this, I said. Can anything be done about people filing false reports? Miguel looked up from his paperwork. If someone files multiple false reports, they can potentially be charged with misuse of emergency services or making false statements to law enforcement. But that's handled by the police and the district attorney's office, not by code enforcement. My suggestion? Start documenting everything. Dates, times, what the complaints were, what the investigations found. If it keeps happening, you might need to get a lawyer involved. After he left, I started a file folder labeled HOA issues. I printed copies of both the daycare citation and the noise complaint letters, along with the investigation reports that cleared me. I had a bad feeling this was not going to be the end of it. I was right. 3 weeks later, on a Tuesday morning, I was heading out to meet a client for coffee when I found a bright orange sticker plastered across my front door. It was a notice from the city fire marshal stating that my property was being investigated for illegal storage of hazardous materials. The notice required me to contact the fire marshal's office within 48 hours. My hands were shaking as I dialed the number. This was getting out of control. The fire marshal's office connected me with an inspector named Thomas Reed, who informed me that they had received a detailed complaint alleging that I was storing large quantities of gasoline, propane, and potentially explosive chemicals in my garage. The complaint included specific details, supposedly 55-gallon drums of gasoline, multiple 20-pound propane tanks, and unmarked containers of flammable liquids. I need to be clear about this, Inspector Reed said, his tone serious. If these allegations are true, you're looking at serious violations that could result in criminal charges. Improper storage of hazardous materials is not something we take lightly. I understand, and I want you to come inspect immediately because none of that is true, I said. I have a gas can for my lawnmower that holds maybe 2 gallons. That's it. No propane tanks, no drums, no chemicals. This is another false report from the same person who's been harassing me. Who filed the complaint? I'd bet everything I own it was Karren Bentley, the HOA president. More keyboard clicking. That's correct. Karren Bentley filed this complaint yesterday evening. She provided quite a bit of detail. All of it fabricated, I said. When can you come inspect? Inspector Reed arrived that afternoon with a partner. They spent over an hour going through my garage, my shed, and even my attic. They documented everything with photographs and notes. When they finished, Inspector Reed pulled me aside. Mr. Morrison, there's nothing here. The only flammable material on your property is a standard 2-gallon gas can that's properly stored and well within legal limits. This complaint was completely false. That's the third false report she's filed against me, I said, pulling out my folder. First, she claimed I was running an illegal daycare. Then she said I was operating industrial equipment at night. Now this, I don't even know why she's targeting me. Inspector Reed looked at the documentation I showed him, his expression growing more serious. This is a pattern. Have you contacted the police? The police came for the first complaint and cleared me. Code enforcement came for the second. You're here for the third. Everyone keeps telling me there's nothing they can do. Here's what I'm going to do, Inspector Reed said. I'm going to note in my report that this is the third false complaint filed by the same individual against you. I'm also going to forward this information to the police department and suggest they open an investigation into harassment. In the meantime, I'd strongly suggest you contact a lawyer. If she's filing false emergency reports, that's a crime. That evening, I drove to Karren's house and knocked on her door. I had tried being patient. I'd tried letting the system work, but this was affecting my life, my reputation, and potentially my career if word got around that I was being investigated for hazardous material storage. Karren answered the door wearing yoga pants and a crisp white shirt, her blonde hair pulled back in a ponytail. She looked at me with an expression of mild surprise, as if we were neighbors who occasionally waved at each other rather than what we actually were. "Xavier, isn't it? How can I help you?" "You can stop filing false reports against me," I said, keeping my voice level. "3 times now you've called the authorities claiming I'm doing things I'm not doing. A daycare, noise violations, hazardous materials. None of it is true, and you know it." Her expression shifted to something that looked almost like concern, but there was something calculated behind her eyes. "I'm simply doing my duty as HOA president to ensure the safety and standards of our community. If investigations have cleared you, then that's wonderful, but I have to act on information when residents express concerns." "What residents? Who complained about me?" "That information is confidential." "Because they don't exist," I said. "You're making up complaints and filing false reports. That's illegal, Karren. The fire marshal told me today that filing false emergency reports is a crime." She stepped back slightly, her hand moving to the door. "I think you should leave now. If you continue to harass me, I'll have no choice but to file a police report." "Harass you? You've sent government officials to my house 3 times in 2 months for things I haven't done. Please leave my property, Xavier, or I will call the police." I wanted to say more, but I realized I was just giving her ammunition. I walked back to my house, my heart pounding with frustration and anger. The next morning, I called a lawyer named Rebecca Summers who specialized in property law and HOA disputes. Her office was in downtown Scottsdale, and she agreed to see me that afternoon. Rebecca was in her 50s, with gray-streaked brown hair and the kind of direct manner that suggested she had dealt with plenty of HOA nightmares in her career. I laid out everything: the 3 false reports, the investigations, my confrontation with Karren. "This is more common than you'd think," Rebecca said, leaning back in her chair. "HOA board members sometimes become overzealous in their enforcement, and occasionally it crosses the line into harassment. The fact that she's filing false reports with government agencies is serious. That's not just a civil matter, it's criminal. So what do I do? First, request all the HOA's documentation related to complaints against your property. You're entitled to that as a homeowner. Second, I'm going to draft a cease and desist letter making it clear that further false reports will result in legal action. Third, we need to file a formal complaint with the police department about the pattern of harassment and false reporting." Over the next week, Rebecca handled the legal groundwork while I tried to get back to some semblance of normal life. The cease and desist letter was delivered to Karren by certified mail. I filed a formal complaint with the Scottsdale Police Department, and they assigned a detective named Sarah Winters to review the case. Detective Winters called me on a Friday afternoon. "Mr. Morrison, I've reviewed your complaint and the investigation reports from the 3 incidents. I've also contacted the responding officers and inspectors. Everyone confirms that the complaints against you were unfounded. I'd like to set up a time to interview you formally and get a complete statement." We met at the police station on Monday morning. Detective Winters was thorough, asking me to walk through each incident in detail, explain my daily routine, describe any interactions I had had with Karren before the complaint started. The interview took almost 2 hours. "Here's what I can tell you," Detective Winters said when we finished. "Filing a false police report is a Class 1 misdemeanor in Arizona under ARS 132907.01. Each false report is a separate offense. If Ms. Bentley filed 3 false reports, that's 3 separate charges. However, I need to investigate further to confirm that she knew the reports were false when she filed them. That's the key element: knowingly filing a false report." "She has to know they're false," I said. "There's no daycare, there's no industrial equipment, there are no hazardous materials. She could have verified any of this by simply asking me or knocking on my door." "I understand your frustration. Let me do some more investigation. I'm going to interview Ms. Bentley, talk to some other neighbors, and review any additional evidence. I'll be in touch." 2 weeks passed, and I heard nothing from Detective Winters. I focused on work, trying to put the whole situation out of my mind. Then, on a Wednesday evening, I heard a knock at my door. It was Karren. She stood on my doorstep looking significantly less composed than during our previous encounter. Her eyes were red-rimmed, and her hands were clutching a piece of paper. "Xavier, we need to talk," she said, her voice tight. "I received a letter from the police department saying I'm under investigation for filing false reports. I need you to call them and tell them this is all a misunderstanding." I stared at her in disbelief. "A misunderstanding? You filed 3 false reports against me. You brought the police, code enforcement, and the fire marshal to my house for things that never happened." "I was just trying to protect the neighborhood," she said, and now there were tears forming. "You moved in and you're always home. You're in your garage at odd hours. You're not married. You don't have kids. It just seemed suspicious. Other neighbors were concerned." "Name one neighbor who complained about me." She hesitated. "It's confidential." "Because there aren't any," I said. "You made everything up because you decided I was suspicious based on nothing but your own assumptions. I work from home because I'm a consultant. I work out in my garage because I like to exercise. I'm not married because I haven't found the right person. None of that justifies what you did." "Please," she said, and now the tears were flowing. "If I get charged with a crime, I could lose my job. I work at a financial firm. They'll fire me if I have a criminal record. My husband will be furious. Please, just tell the police you don't want to press charges." "It doesn't work that way, Karren. You filed false reports with government agencies. This isn't a civil dispute anymore. The district attorney's office will decide whether to press charges, not me." She opened her mouth to say something else, but I held up my hand. "I think you should leave now, and I'd suggest you get a lawyer." I closed the door while she was still standing there. Part of me felt a twinge of sympathy. She clearly hadn't thought through the consequences of her actions, but a larger part of me was still angry. She had disrupted my life, damaged my reputation with the neighbors, and caused me significant stress and expense, all because she had decided I didn't fit her picture of what a proper neighbor should be. The next morning, Detective Winters called. "Mr. Morrison, I wanted to update you on the investigation. I've interviewed Ms. Bentley and several of your neighbors. None of the neighbors corroborated any of her complaints. In fact, most of them said you're quiet and keep to yourself. Ms. Bentley admitted that she filed all 3 reports based on her own observations, not on complaints from other residents. So what happens now? I'm completing my investigation report and forwarding it to the district attorney's office with a recommendation for charges. Based on what I've found, I believe there's sufficient evidence to charge her with 3 counts of filing a false report. The DA will make the final decision." "How long will that take?" "Usually a few weeks. They have to review the evidence and decide whether to file charges. I'll keep you updated." 3 weeks later, I received a call from the Maricopa County District Attorney's Office. A prosecutor named David Chen asked if I could come in to discuss the case against Karren Bentley. I met him at the DA's office on a Monday morning. David Chen was younger than I expected, probably in his mid-30s, with dark hair and an intense focus as he reviewed the file in front of him. "Mr. Morrison, I've reviewed Detective Winters' investigation report and all the supporting documentation. This is a strong case. Ms. Bentley filed 3 separate false reports to different government agencies, all of which required law enforcement response and investigation. Each incident wasted government resources and caused you significant distress. So you're going to charge her? That's why I wanted to meet with you. Before we proceed, I want to understand the full scope of what happened. Detective Winters documented 3 false reports: the daycare allegation, the noise complaint, and the hazardous materials complaint. In your experience, were there any other incidents?" I thought about it. "Not formal reports that I know of. But she's the HOA president, and I've received several notices from the HOA about minor violations: my trash can being visible from the street 15 minutes before collection started, my grass being allegedly too long when it was within the limits specified in the CC and Rs, things like that. I don't know if those count." David made notes. "Those are civil HOA matters, not false reports to law enforcement. For criminal charges, we're focused on the false reports made to government agencies. However, the pattern of HOA harassment could be relevant in establishing motive and intent." What happens if you charge her? She'll be arraigned, enter a plea, and if she pleads not guilty, we'll proceed to trial. If convicted, she's looking at potential jail time, fines, and a criminal record. Each count of filing a false report is a Class 1 misdemeanor, punishable by up to 6 months in jail and a fine of up to $2,500 per count. Will I have to testify? Most likely, yes. You're the victim in this case, and your testimony about what happened will be important. I left the DA's office feeling a strange mix of vindication and unease. I wanted Karren to be held accountable for what she had done, but I also knew this was going to make living in the neighborhood extremely uncomfortable. 2 weeks later, I received a victim notification letter from the DA's office informing me that Karren Bentley had been formally charged with 3 counts of filing a false report. Her arraignment was scheduled for the following month. The news spread through the Sunset Ridge community quickly. Suddenly, neighbors who had barely acknowledged me before were stopping to talk, asking what had happened, expressing sympathy or, in some cases, their own frustrations with Karren's heavy-handed approach to HOA enforcement. My next-door neighbor, a retired teacher named Margaret, knocked on my door one evening with a casserole and an apology. "I heard what Karren did to you," she said. "I'm so sorry. She's been difficult for years, but I never thought she'd go this far. Several of us have been discussing removing her from the HOA board." "I appreciate that," I said, accepting the casserole. "I honestly just want to live here peacefully." "You should know," Margaret continued, "there's an emergency HOA meeting scheduled for next week. The board is considering Karren's position given the criminal charges. You might want to attend." The emergency HOA meeting was held at the community center on a Tuesday evening. I almost didn't go. The whole situation had already consumed too much of my time and energy. But Rebecca, my lawyer, suggested I attend to observe and to let the other homeowners see me as a reasonable person who had been wronged. The community center was packed. Nearly 40 homeowners showed up, which was apparently unprecedented for an HOA meeting. Karren sat in the front row with her husband, a tall man with silver hair who looked deeply uncomfortable. Her expression was stony, defensive. The HOA board consisted of 5 members, Karren as president, and 4 others who served as vice president, secretary, treasurer, and a member at large. The vice president, a man named Gerald who looked to be in his 60s, called the meeting to order. "Thank you all for coming," Gerald said. "We're here to address the situation involving our HOA president, Karren Bentley, who has been charged with 3 counts of filing false reports related to complaints against one of our residents, Xavier Morrison. This is an emergency meeting to determine whether Ms. Bentley should continue in her role as president." Karren stood up immediately. "This is a witch hunt. I did what I thought was right to protect our community. Xavier Morrison moved in 6 months ago, and his behavior was suspicious. I had a duty to report potential violations. You reported him for running an illegal daycare when he was working out in his garage," someone called out from the audience. "How is that protecting the community?" "You filed false reports with the police and the fire marshal," another voice added. "That's not protecting anyone, that's harassment." The meeting devolved into arguments for several minutes before Gerald called for order. "We need to vote on this matter. The board proposes removing Karren Bentley as HOA president effective immediately, given that the criminal charges against her have brought negative attention to our community and violated the trust necessary for this position. All in favor?" 4 hands went up, everyone on the board except Karren herself. The motion passes. "Karren, you're removed as HOA president. We'll hold elections for a new president within the next 30 days. Karren stood up, her face flushed with anger and humiliation. "You're all making a mistake. I've dedicated 3 years to this HOA, keeping this community's standards high, protecting property values. This is how you repay me?" "By filing false police reports," Gerald said quietly. "Karren, you crossed a line. What you did was illegal, and it put this HOA at risk of a lawsuit. Mr. Morrison could sue the HOA for harassment because you were acting in your capacity as president." That thought clearly hadn't occurred to me, but I saw Rebecca make a note on her phone. Given how much this had cost me in time, stress, and legal fees, maybe a lawsuit wasn't a bad idea. Karren grabbed her purse and stormed out of the meeting, her husband following behind her with an apologetic look at the room. After the meeting, Several neighbors approached me to apologize and introduce themselves. Most admitted they hadn't even been aware there were complaints against me until the news of the charges came out. A few shared their own stories of overzealous enforcement by Karren fines for minor infractions, threatening letters about paint colors or lawn decorations, demands for documentation over trivial matters. She once fined me $200 because my Christmas lights were still up on January 2nd, one neighbor told me. The CC and Rs say seasonal decorations must be removed within 1 week of the holiday. She measured it to the day. As I drove home that night, I felt a sense of relief. At least the HOA situation was resolved, but the criminal case was still pending, and I knew that was going to be a much longer process. Karren's arraignment was held on a Thursday morning in early April. I didn't attend. Rebecca said it wasn't necessary unless I wanted to see the process. Karren pleaded not guilty to all 3 charges, and a trial date was set for June. Over the next 2 months, I tried to get back to my normal routine. Work kept me busy. I made more of an effort to get to know my neighbors, and most of them turned out to be genuinely nice people who were glad to be free of Karren's dictatorial approach to HOA management. The new HOA president was a retired engineer named Paul, who took a much more reasonable approach focused on actual issues rather than creating problems where none existed. In May, I received a subpoena to testify at Karren's trial. The trial was scheduled for June 15th, and I was listed as the primary witness for the prosecution. I met with David Chen, the prosecutor, a week before the trial to prepare. We went through each incident in detail, reviewing the timeline, the investigation reports, and the evidence. David explained that the defense would likely argue that Karren had made honest mistakes, that she genuinely believed the complaints were valid based on her observations. Our job is to prove that she knew the complaints were false, or, at minimum, that she showed reckless disregard for the truth, David explained. The fact that she filed multiple reports without ever talking to you, without verifying any of her allegations, and despite being told by investigators that previous complaints were unfounded, that all supports our case. What about the other incidents, I asked? The HOA notices and fines for minor things? We can use those to establish a pattern of harassment, but they're not part of the criminal charges. We're focused on the 3 false reports to law enforcement. The trial began on June 15th at the Maricopa County Superior Court. The courtroom was smaller than I expected, with rows of benches for spectators, a jury box, and the judge's bench at the front. Judge Patricia Morales presided, a woman in her 60s with gray hair and a no-nonsense demeanor. Jury selection took most of the first day. David and Karren's defense attorney, a man named Robert Hayes, questioned potential jurors about their views on HOAs, their experiences with neighbors, and their understanding of reasonable doubt. By the end of the day, a jury of 12 was seated, 7 women and 5 men, ranging in age from their 20s to their 70s. The trial proper began on day 2. David gave his opening statement, laying out the case clearly and methodically. Ladies and gentlemen, this case is about a woman who abused her position as HOA president to harass a neighbor she decided didn't belong in her community. Karren Bentley filed not 1, not 2, but 3 separate false reports to law enforcement agencies, each time claiming that Xavier Morrison was engaged in illegal activity. She claimed he was running an illegal daycare. She claimed he was operating industrial equipment late at night. She claimed he was storing hazardous materials. None of it was true. Law enforcement investigated each claim and found nothing. This wasn't honest mistakes. This was a deliberate pattern of false reporting designed to intimidate and harass Mr. Morrison. Robert Hayes gave the defense's opening statement next. This case is about a dedicated community leader who took her responsibilities seriously. Karren Bentley served as HOA president for 3 years, working to maintain property values and ensure the safety of her neighborhood. When she observed activity at Mr. Morrison's home that concerned her, she did what any responsible person would do. She reported it to the appropriate authorities. The authorities investigated and determined there were no violations. That doesn't make her reports false. That makes them mistaken. There's a big difference. And by the end of this trial, you'll see that Ms. Bentley acted in good faith, not with criminal intent. I was called as the first witness. David walked me through each incident, asking me to describe what happened, how I learned about the complaints, and what the investigations found. I kept my answers factual and straightforward. Then Robert Hayes cross-examined me. Mr. Morrison, isn't it true that you work from home and you're often in your garage during the day? Yes, I work out there in the mornings. And your garage door is often open during these workouts? Yes, for ventilation. So someone driving by might see movement, might hear sounds coming from your garage, correct? They might see me exercising, yes? And you're not married? You don't have children, you live alone, is that correct? Yes. So someone observing your property might not know what you're doing inside your home, correct? They could knock on my door and ask, I said. That's what normal neighbors do. But Ms. Bentley didn't know you well, isn't that right? You'd only met once. That's correct. And instead of getting to know me or asking me questions, she filed false reports claiming I was breaking the law. Robert tried to paint Karren as a concerned neighbor who made honest mistakes, but David's redirect questions undermined that narrative. Mr. Morrison, after the first complaint was investigated and you were cleared, did Ms. Bentley ever apologize or contact you? No. After the second complaint was investigated and you were cleared, did she apologize then? No. She filed a third complaint. And after you confronted her about the false reports, what did she say? She said she was doing her duty as HOA president, and the complaints from residents were confidential. Did she ever name a single resident who had complained about you? No, because there weren't any. The police officer who responded to the daycare complaint testified next, describing how he investigated and found only workout equipment. Miguel from Code Enforcement testified about the noise complaint investigation, explaining that there was no equipment that could generate the alleged sounds. Inspector Reed from the fire marshal's office testified about the hazardous materials complaint, describing how he found nothing more than a standard gas can properly stored. Then, Detective Winters took the stand. She testified about her investigation, including her interviews with Karren and with other neighbors. Did any of the neighbors you interviewed corroborate Ms. Bentley's complaints about Mr. Morrison? David asked. No. Several neighbors said they had never noticed any issues with Mr. Morrison's property. Some said they barely saw him except occasionally when he was leaving for work or mowing his lawn. When you interviewed Ms. Bentley, did she claim that other neighbors had complained to her about Mr. Morrison? Yes. She claimed multiple neighbors had expressed concerns. Did she provide any names or documentation of these complaints? No. She said it was confidential HOA business. Did you investigate whether these alleged complaints actually existed? I requested all HOA records related to Mr. Morrison's property. The HOA secretary provided me with the documents. There were no complaints from other residents. The only documentation was Ms. Bentley's own reports. On cross-examination, Robert tried to suggest that maybe neighbors had complained verbally without formal documentation, but Detective Winters shut that down. I interviewed 10 neighbors on Mr. Morrison's street. Not one of them said they had complained to Ms. Bentley about him. Several said they didn't even know who he was. On the third day of trial, Karren testified in her own defense. She wore a navy suit and looked composed as she took the stand. Robert walked her through her background, her 3 years as HOA president, her dedication to the community, her efforts to maintain property standards. Ms. Bentley, why did you file the first complaint about the daycare? Robert asked. I drove by Mr. Morrison's house multiple times in the morning and saw his garage door open with movement inside, Karren said. It looked like there were multiple people in there. Given that he doesn't have children, I thought perhaps he was running an unlicensed daycare. I felt I had a duty to report it for the safety of any children who might be there. Did you believe this complaint was true when you filed it? Yes, absolutely. I thought I was protecting children. What about the noise complaint? I was awake late one night and heard sounds coming from the direction of his house. It sounded mechanical, like equipment running. I filed a complaint because late-night noise violates our community standards. And the hazardous materials complaint? I saw him carrying containers from his car to his garage. They looked like they could be fuel or chemical containers. Again, I thought I was protecting the neighborhood. David's cross-examination was devastating. Ms. Bentley, before you filed the daycare complaint, did you ever knock on Mr. Morrison's door to ask what he was doing in his garage? No. Why not? I didn't think it was necessary. I could see what I thought was happening. You thought you saw children in his garage. I saw movement that could have been children. Did you see children, yes or no? Karren hesitated. Not clearly, no. So you filed a police report claiming he was running an illegal daycare based on seeing unclear movement in his garage. I believed I was doing the right thing. After the police investigated and found no daycare, did you apologize to Mr. Morrison? No. Did you feel any need to verify your assumptions before filing the next complaint? I filed the next complaint based on different circumstances. You filed the noise complaint claiming he was operating industrial equipment between 11 at night and 2 in the morning. Correct? Yes. Were you awake during those hours every night for a week observing his property? Karren shifted uncomfortably. I was awake several nights and heard noises. Mr. Morrison works from home and goes to bed early most nights. Are you saying you heard industrial equipment sounds coming from a house where the owner was asleep? I heard what I thought were mechanical sounds. Did you verify this with any other neighbors? Did you ask anyone else if they heard these sounds? No. Because no one else heard them, did they, Ms. Bentley? I don't know what other people heard. David pulled up a document on the screen. This is the code enforcement report from Miguel Santos. It states that he used a decibel meter and found ambient noise levels at Mr. Morrison's property were well within normal residential limits. It also states that none of the neighbors he interviewed reported hearing unusual noises. Were you mistaken about the noise, Ms. Bentley? I heard what I heard. Or did you make it up to file another false report? Objection, Robert said. Withdrawn, David said. Let's talk about the hazardous materials complaint. You claimed Mr. Morrison was storing 55-gallon drums of gasoline and multiple propane tanks in his garage. Where did you get those specific details? Karren's face was flushed. I assumed based on what I saw. You assumed he had 55-gallon drums? I thought the containers looked large. The fire marshal found one 2-gallon gas can. Does a 2-gallon gas can look like a 55-gallon drum to you, Ms. Bentley? I was mistaken about the size. You were mistaken, or you exaggerated to make the complaint sound more serious. I was trying to protect the neighborhood. By filing false reports? They weren't false, I believed them at the time. After the first 2 complaints were investigated and found to be baseless, why didn't you stop? Why file a 3rd complaint? Karren didn't answer immediately. Finally, she said, I still had concerns about Mr. Morrison's activities. What activities? He works from home, he exercises in his garage, he mows his lawn. What exactly concerned you, Ms. Bentley? He didn't fit the profile of our neighborhood. What does that mean? He's single, he doesn't socialize, he keeps odd hours sometimes. It just seemed suspicious. So you filed false police reports because you thought he didn't fit in. I didn't file false reports. I filed reports based on my observations. Observations that were wrong every single time? Objection, Robert said, argumentative. Sustained, Judge Morales said, but the damage was done. Karren's testimony had made it clear that she filed the reports based on her own biases and assumptions, not on any actual evidence of wrongdoing. The prosecution rested, and the defense called only one additional witness, Karren's husband, Marcus, who testified that his wife was dedicated to the community and acted in good faith. But even his testimony fell flat under David's cross-examination. Mr. Bentley, did your wife discuss these complaints with you before she filed them? Some of them, yes. Did you ever suggest she might be wrong about what she thought she saw? Marcus hesitated. I told her she should talk to Mr. Morrison directly. Did she take your advice? No. Closing arguments happened on day 4. David was methodical, walking the jury through each false report, the investigations that disproved them, and the pattern of harassment. Ladies and gentlemen, this case is straightforward. Karren Bentley filed 3 false reports to law enforcement. She knew they were false, or at minimum, she showed reckless disregard for the truth. She never verified her assumptions. She never talked to Mr. Morrison. She never apologized when she was proven wrong. Instead, she kept filing more complaints, trying to drive a man out of his home for no reason other than her own prejudice. That's not community protection. That's criminal harassment. Robert's closing argument tried to emphasize reasonable doubt. Karren Bentley made mistakes, but mistakes aren't crimes. She thought she saw suspicious activity and reported it. Maybe she was wrong. But that doesn't mean she knowingly filed false reports. The law requires proof beyond a reasonable doubt that she knew these reports were false. The prosecution hasn't met that burden. Judge Morrison gave the jury their instructions, explaining the legal standard for filing a false report, knowingly making false statements to law enforcement with the intent to mislead or harass. The jury deliberated for 6 hours before returning with a verdict. I sat in the courtroom, my palms sweating, as the jury foreman stood to read the verdict. In the matter of the state of Arizona versus Karren Bentley, on count 1, filing a false report regarding an illegal daycare, we find the defendant guilty. Karren's sharp intake of breath was audible across the courtroom. On count 2, filing a false report regarding noise violations, we find the defendant guilty. On count 3, filing a false report regarding hazardous materials, we find the defendant guilty. Karren burst into tears, and her husband put his arm around her. Judge Morrison thanked the jury for their service and scheduled sentencing for 3 weeks later. As I walked out of the courtroom, David caught up with me. That was a strong verdict, all 3 counts. The judge will determine sentencing, but given that these are Class 1 misdemeanors and this is her first offense, she's probably looking at probation, fines, and possibly some jail time. Do you think she'll actually serve jail time? It's possible. The judge will consider the seriousness of the offenses, the impact on you, and whether she shows remorse. If she's smart, she'll express genuine remorse at sentencing and hope for leniency. 3 weeks later, I returned to court for Karren's sentencing hearing. Robert Hayes called several character witnesses who testified about Karren's community involvement and her previous good record. Marcus testified tearfully about how this had affected their family and begged for leniency. Then, I was given the opportunity to make a victim impact statement. I stood at the podium looking at Karren, who wouldn't meet my eyes. Your Honor, what Karren Bentley did to me wasn't just illegal, it was deeply personal. She decided I didn't belong in her neighborhood, and she used her position as HOA president to try to drive me out. She brought police to my door. She brought code enforcement, the fire marshal. She made me feel unwelcome in my own home. She cost me thousands of dollars in legal fees. She caused me stress and anxiety. And even after she was caught, even after she was charged, she never once apologized. She claimed at trial that she was protecting the neighborhood, but what she was really doing was protecting her narrow view of what the neighborhood should be. I don't say this lightly, but I believe she should be held accountable for what she did, not just for my sake, but to send a message that you can't abuse positions of authority to harass people. Judge Morrison listened carefully, then addressed Karren directly. Ms. Bentley, you held a position of trust in your community, and you abused that trust. You filed not 1, but 3 false reports to law enforcement, wasting government resources and causing significant harm to Mr. Morrison. These were not honest mistakes. The evidence showed a pattern of conduct driven by your personal biases. You never attempted to verify your allegations. You never spoke with Mr. Morrison. And even after being proven wrong repeatedly, you continued to file complaints. This court takes these offenses seriously. Judge Morrison sentenced Karren to 30 days in jail for each count, to be served consecutively for a total of 90 days. However, she suspended 80 days of the sentence, meaning Karren would serve 10 days in jail. She also ordered Karren to pay a fine of $2,000 per count for a total of $6,000, plus restitution to me for my legal expenses, which totaled approximately $8,000. Finally, she placed Karren on probation for 1 year, with conditions including no contact with me and completion of anger management classes. Karren was taken into custody immediately to begin serving her jail sentence. As the bailiff led her away, she finally looked at me, and for the first time, I saw something that might have been genuine regret in her eyes. Walking out of the courthouse that day, I felt a complicated mix of emotions: relief that it was finally over, vindication that the justice system had worked, but also a kind of sadness that it had come to this, that a neighbor dispute had escalated to criminal charges and jail time. Rebecca met me outside. That's about as good an outcome as we could have hoped for. She was convicted on all counts, and the judge made it clear that her conduct was serious. The restitution will help cover your costs. Do you think she'll appeal? She might, but appeals are expensive and time-consuming, and the verdict was strong. My guess is she'll serve her time and try to move on. Over the following months, life in Sunset Ridge gradually returned to normal. Karren served her 10-day jail sentence and was released. She and Marcus listed their house for sale shortly after, and by October, they had moved out of the neighborhood entirely. The new HOA president, Paul, ran the association with a light touch, focusing on actual maintenance issues rather than manufacturing problems. I got to know more of my neighbors and found that most of them were decent people who just wanted to live their lives in peace. Some of them apologized for not speaking up sooner about Karren's behavior, but I didn't hold it against them. Nobody wants to get involved in neighbor disputes if they can avoid it. The whole experience taught me several lessons. First, that HOA boards have real power, and that power can be abused if the wrong person gets into a position of authority. Second, that standing up for yourself is important, even when it's difficult and uncomfortable. If I had just let Karren's first false report slide, she would have kept going. And who knows how much worse it could have gotten. Third, that the legal system, for all its flaws, can work if you document everything and persist through the process. By the time winter rolled around, I'd mostly put the whole ordeal behind me. I focused on my work, made some good friends in the neighborhood, and even started dating a woman named Jennifer Davis, who worked as a teacher at a local elementary school. We met at a community barbecue that Paul organized, part of his effort to build a more connected, less contentious neighborhood culture. One evening in December, I was hanging Christmas lights on my house when Margaret, my next-door neighbor, walked over with a plate of cookies. "These are for you," she said. "A thank you for standing up to Karren. A lot of us were intimidated by her, but nobody wanted to be the one to challenge her. You did us all a favor." "I didn't really have a choice," I said. "She wasn't going to stop." Still, the neighborhood is better now, more relaxed. People are actually talking to each other instead of worrying about violating some obscure HOA rule. That night, sitting on my couch with a cup of hot chocolate, I reflected on the past year. It had been one of the most stressful periods of my life, dealing with false accusations, legal proceedings, and the uncertainty of how it would all turn out. But it had also shown me the importance of community, of standing up for what's right, and of not letting bullies, even ones with clipboards and HOA authority, push you around. Karren Bentley had filed 6 false reports against me total. If I counted correctly, though only 3 of them rose to the level of criminal charges because they involved law enforcement agencies. The district attorney had charged her with all 3 criminal counts, and she had been convicted on every one. Justice had been served, not just for me, but as a precedent that abuse of HOA authority and filing false reports would have real consequences. I finished hanging my Christmas lights, stepped back to admire the display, and smiled. They were probably a bit over-the-top colorful bulbs outlining the entire roofline, a lit-up snowman on the lawn, candy cane decorations lining the walkway. Old Karren would have had a fit. But new HOA President Paul had just given me a thumbs up when he drove by earlier. In the end, I got what I wanted when I first bought the house in Sunset Ridge, a peaceful place to live, good neighbors, and a home where I could just be myself without constantly looking over my shoulder. It had taken a criminal trial to get there, but it was worth it. Sometimes standing up for yourself means going through uncomfortable confrontations, expensive legal bills, and stressful court proceedings. But the alternative, letting someone drive you out of your home through harassment and false accusations, would have been worse. I had learned that I was stronger than I thought, that the justice system could work when you had the truth on your side, and that communities were better off when people who abuse power are held accountable. As I walked back inside, my phone buzzed with a text from Jennifer asking if I wanted to grab dinner. I smiled and replied, yes. Life was good, and it was only getting better. The nightmare with Karren Bentley was over, and I could finally just enjoy being home. The 10 days Karren spent in jail had apparently been transformative, or at least that was what I heard through the neighborhood grapevine. According to Margaret, who somehow knew everything about everyone, Karren had spent most of her jail time in a state of shock, realizing how far her obsession with control had taken her. The criminal record meant she had lost her job at the financial firm, just as she had feared. Marcus had apparently been furious, not just about the legal consequences, but about the financial impact between her legal fees, the fines, and the restitution. They had spent nearly $30,000 on her mistake. But I tried not to dwell on her downfall. I had spent enough time and energy on Karren Bentley. Now I focused on building the life I wanted in Scottsdale, free from harassment and false accusations. In January, I received a check from Karren for $8,000. The court ordered restitution for my legal expenses. Rebecca had warned me that sometimes people drag their feet on paying restitution, but Karren paid within the deadline, probably because violating the terms of her probation would have meant going back to jail for the suspended portion of her sentence. With that money back in my account, I felt like I could finally close the book on the entire experience. I took Jennifer out for a nice dinner to celebrate, and we talked about the future, about maybe taking a trip together in the spring, about what we each wanted out of life, about the possibility of something serious developing between us. "Can I ask you something?" Jennifer said over dessert. "How did you stay so calm through all of that? I mean, having someone file false police reports against you, going through a trial, all of it. I would have been a wreck." I thought about it. Honestly, I was a wreck sometimes. There were nights I couldn't sleep, worrying about what she might do next, whether the charges would actually stick, whether the jury would believe me. But I also knew I hadn't done anything wrong. That gave me something solid to hold on to. And I had good people helping me, Rebecca, the detective, the prosecutor. I wasn't alone in it. "Still," Jennifer said, "it takes strength to stand up to someone like that, especially when they are in a position of authority." I didn't really see it as a choice. If I hadn't stood up to her, she would have kept going until she drove me out. And that would have meant she won, that being a bully worked. I couldn't let that happen. Jennifer reached across the table and took my hand. "I'm glad you didn't." By spring, life had settled into a comfortable rhythm. Work was going well. I'd landed several new clients and was considering hiring an assistant to help manage the workload. My relationship with Jennifer was growing stronger. The neighborhood was peaceful under Paul's leadership. He focused on actual issues like maintaining common areas and organizing community events rather than nitpicking minor violations. In April, I got a call from David Chen, the prosecutor. "Xavier, I wanted to give you an update. Karren Bentley completed her jail sentence and is now on probation. She's been compliant with all the terms. She completed her anger management classes, she paid the fines and restitution on time, and she hasn't violated the no-contact order. Unless something changes, she'll complete her probation in about 8 months without any issues." "That's good to hear," I said. "I hope she learned something from all this." "Between you and me," David said, "I think she did. Her lawyer told me she's been seeing a therapist to work through some control issues. Losing her job and spending time in jail was apparently a wake-up call. Not everyone changes, but some do." After I hung up, I thought about Karren and wondered what her life was like now. She had lost her job, her position in the HOA, her home, and her reputation, all because she couldn't let go of her need to control everything around her. It was a cautionary tale about what happens when people let their biases and need for control override their common sense and decency. But I also recognized that holding on to anger and resentment wasn't good for me. She had been punished by the legal system. She had paid her debt. What she did with the rest of her life was her business, as long as she stayed away from me. In May, exactly 1 year after the whole ordeal had begun with that first false police report about the non-existent daycare, I hosted a barbecue at my house. I invited Jennifer, several neighbors including Margaret and Paul, and a few friends from work. We grilled burgers and hot dogs, drank beer and lemonade, played cornhole in the backyard, and enjoyed the perfect Arizona spring weather. As the sun set and people laughed and talked around me, I realized how much my life had changed in a year. I had gone from feeling like an outsider in my own neighborhood, constantly under scrutiny and harassment, to being surrounded by friends and feeling genuinely at home. Margaret pulled me aside at one point. "You know, Xavier, this neighborhood needed what happened with Karren. Not the ugly parts, nobody wanted that. But we needed someone to stand up and say, enough is enough. We needed to remember that HOAs are supposed to serve the community, not control it. You did that. I just wanted to live in peace, I said, and now you can. We all can. That summer, Paul organized the first annual Sunset Ridge Block Party, something Karren would never have approved because it involved closing off the street for several hours and allowing kids to play in the cul-de-sac. Nearly every house participated, with families setting up tables in their driveways, sharing food, and getting to know each other. Jennifer and I set up a smoothie station, blending fresh fruit drinks for anyone who wanted one. Kids ran around with water balloons. A group of teenagers organized a basketball tournament. Someone brought a portable speaker and played music. It was chaotic and loud and absolutely wonderful. This was what a neighborhood was supposed to be: people living together, looking out for each other, building community rather than tearing it down with petty rules and false accusations. As the evening wound down and Jennifer and I cleaned up our station, I thought about writing a letter to Karren. Not an angry letter, but maybe one that expressed some kind of closure, some acknowledgement that we had both moved on. But then I decided against it. The no-contact order was still in effect, and beyond that, there was nothing left to say. We had each learned our lessons, paid our prices, and moved forward. That was enough. In August, I proposed to Jennifer on a hiking trip in the Superstition Mountains. She said yes, and we started planning a small wedding for the following spring. Margaret immediately volunteered to help with planning, and several other neighbors offered their homes or yards for the reception. The sense of community in Sunset Ridge had become something real and meaningful, a far cry from the fearful, rule-obsessed environment Karren had created. Looking back on everything that had happened, the false reports, the investigations, the trial, the conviction, I recognized that it had been a defining experience in my life. It had taught me about standing up for myself, about the importance of documentation and legal representation, about how systems of justice work when you engage with them properly. But more than that, it had taught me about community and what it means to be a good neighbor. It's not about perfect lawns and trash cans being invisible and reporting every minor deviation from arbitrary rules. It's about respect, communication, and giving people the benefit of the doubt. It's about building relationships rather than filing complaints. Karren Bentley had filed 6 false reports against me, and the district attorney had charged her with 3 counts of filing false reports to law enforcement, the ones that rose to the level of criminal charges. She had been convicted on all 3 counts, sentenced to jail time, fined, and ordered to pay restitution. The legal system had worked exactly as it should have, holding her accountable for abusing her authority and harassing a neighbor based on nothing more than her own biases and need for control. In the end, justice had been served, and I had gotten my life back. The house I had bought in Sunset Ridge had truly become my home, not despite what had happened with Karren, but in some ways because of it. I had been forced to stand up for myself, to engage with my neighbors, to build real connections rather than just coexisting behind closed doors. As I stood on my back patio that evening, watching the sunset over the Arizona desert, Jennifer beside me talking about wedding flowers, I felt genuinely grateful. Not for what Karren had done that had been wrong and hurtful and illegal, but for what I had learned about myself, about community, and about the importance of standing up against injustice, even when it's uncomfortable and difficult. Karren Bentley had tried to drive me out of my home with her false reports and harassment. Instead, she had inadvertently made me more committed to staying, more connected to my neighbors, and more appreciative of what real community means. Her attempt to control and intimidate had backfired completely, and in the process, she had lost everything while I had gained a home, friends, and a future with someone I loved. That, I thought, was the real ending to the story, not just that she had been punished for her crimes, but that her actions had led to positive changes in the neighborhood and in my own life. Sunset Ridge was a better place now, more welcoming and less fearful. And I was exactly where I belonged, ready to build a life with Jennifer, surrounded by good neighbors and genuine community. The nightmare was over, and the dream of what a neighborhood could be had taken its place.